I stood at the edge of Grid Alpha, the outermost training sector, flat desert, nothing special, and looked at fighting positions that had no business existing. 8 months ago, real time, this grid had hosted a basic mechanized assault package. 2 simulated battalions running movement-to-contact drills across open ground. The scenario called for hasty fighting positions, shallow scrapes, the kind of thing you dig in 20 minutes and abandon by lunch. What I was looking at had been dug by years. The positions were deep, riveted with packed earth and welded vehicle armor, and they faced outward, toward the perimeter, toward the gate I'd walked through 4 minutes ago. My name is Gareth Lusk, Chief Warrant Officer, Range Safety. I co-wrote the certification that declared Range 19's temporal compression dome safe for operational use, a dome that bends time inside its perimeter, so you can run years of simulated combat in a few real-world days. Good training. Humane, even, because nobody dies in a simulation. My signature is on the document. And 2 weeks ago, the dome's edge started creeping outward across the New Mexico desert at a rate of about 3 meters per day, and nobody could explain why. And satellite imagery showed the interior landscape reshaping itself into something that didn't match any exercise package ever loaded into the system. So here I was, on foot, because drones came back with months of garbled flight data from minutes of overflight and nobody trusted them anymore. Carrying a survey camera, a clipboard, a sidearm I had no illusions about, and a temporal exposure gauge strapped to my left wrist, a device about the size of a watch that measured the difference between my subjective time and local elapsed time inside the dome. The gauge read 11 minutes local against 4 minutes subjective, a ratio of roughly 2.7 to 1, within tolerance. The certification I wrote allowed up to 15 to 1 for standard training cycles. The certification I wrote assumed the dome would be turned off between cycles. Captain Herrera, the perimeter watch officer, had walked me to the gate. Young guy, engineer branch, visibly unhappy about the whole arrangement. He'd told me the last drone they'd sent through had logged 14 months of flight recorder data from a 6-minute overflight. He'd told me the compression ratio appeared to be accelerating toward the dome's center, which meant deeper grid sectors might be running at ratios no one had ever tested. He'd marked my entry time on a clipboard and asked me how long I expected to be inside. 8 hours subjective, I'd told him. If the ratio holds, that's about a day local. I'll reach the control bunker, trigger the manual shutdown, and walk back out. He'd looked at the trenches visible just past the gate and asked me what happened if the ratio didn't hold. I hadn't answered that. The supply road was still there. That was the first thing I checked. A graded dirt track that ran from the perimeter gate straight through Grid Alpha toward the interior sectors, originally built so support vehicles could service the training range between exercises. It was cracked and weathered in a way that suggested years of sun and wind erosion, which made sense. Inside the dome, years had passed. But the road surface had also been cut by lateral trenches at irregular intervals, and each trench crossing had been bridged with steel plates stripped from vehicle hulls. Someone, something, had maintained transit across those cuts. The road was interrupted but passable. On purpose. I walked it. Camera up, documenting everything. The fighting positions flanking the road were uniform in depth and construction. 3 meters deep, timber and metal revetment, overhead cover made from layered armor plate. Each one had a clear firing lane oriented toward the perimeter. Between the positions, communication trenches ran in angled zigzags. Proper defensive design, the kind you'd find in a military engineering textbook. Not the hasty scrapes of a 2-day exercise. Someone had spent years building this. The vehicle hulks bothered me most. Range 19's simulated battles used real vehicles, old M113s, decommissioned Bradleys, surplus trucks, fitted with blank fire systems and kill switch electronics. After each exercise, The wrecked vehicles were supposed to be left in place as terrain obstacles for the next scenario. That was standard range procedure. I'd written that procedure. Over multiple exercise cycles, a training range accumulates a junkyard of hulks in various states of destruction, scattered across the landscape in whatever pattern the last battle left them. These hulks weren't scattered. They'd been moved. I stopped at a Bradley chassis that had been dragged, drag marks still visible in the hardpan, though weathered to shallow grooves, roughly 400 meters from where its kill switch should have dropped it during the last Grid Alpha exercise. It sat nose deep in a prepared position, its hull reinforced with welded plates from at least 2 other vehicles. The turret ring had been packed with stone and earth to create a solid firing platform, and a section of gun tube from an M113 had been wedged into the gap, giving the position a functional-looking barrel aimed at the perimeter road. Non-functional, no ammunition, no fire control, but oriented and braced with the kind of care that suggested intent. I photographed it, measured the drag marks, wrote down the GPS coordinates and the hull number stenciled on the Bradley's flank, which told me this vehicle had been killed in Exercise Package 14, a scenario run in Grid Charlie, 6 kilometers deeper inside the dome. Something had dragged a dead Bradley 6 kilometers and put it in a firing position. I kept walking. The road curved south to avoid a low ridge, natural terrain, one of the few rock formations inside the dome's footprint, and past the ridge the landscape dropped into a shallow depression where Grid Alpha's scenario had staged its objective. The objective buildings were gone, not destroyed, disassembled. I could see the foundation slabs where prefab structures had stood, and around each slab the ground was scarred with marks where material had been dragged away. I followed one set of drag marks to a section of trenchwork and found the wall reinforced with the grey composite panels that had been the building's exterior cladding. Repurposed. Every piece of infrastructure the scenario had placed in Grid Alpha had been stripped and rebuilt into fortification. My gauge read 2 hours local, 14 minutes subjective. The ratio was climbing. Past the objective depression, the communication trenches thickened into a network I couldn't see the bottom of. I climbed to the top of the low ridge for a better view and found a footpath worn into the rock, a trail beaten smooth by traffic, not vehicle traffic. The path was too narrow and the wear pattern was wrong for tires. Something had walked this path over and over, thousands of times, enough to polish sandstone. I followed the path along the ridge crest and looked down into the trench network below. What I saw was a logistics trail. It ran through the center of the network like a spine, threading between fighting positions and vehicle emplacements, and it had been maintained. Where walls had caved in, they'd been shored up with timber and scrap. Where the trail crossed deep communication trenches, bridges of welded plate spanned the gaps. The trail was clear, level, and continuous, a functional transit route running from the outer defenses straight toward the interior of the dome. Along its length, the repurposed vehicle hulks had been arranged at regular intervals, their stripped-out interiors converted into shelters with cut firing ports and overhead cover. Way stations, rest points. Whatever had built this trail had built it for sustained movement over distance. I stood on that ridge for a while. The sun, or what passed for it, a bright wash across the dome's inner surface far overhead, sat at a fixed angle that never changed because the dome didn't simulate day-night cycles. Permanent noon. The shadows were short and hard-edged, and in every one I could see more trenchwork, more positions, more repurposed metal. The density increased towards the interior. Grid Alpha was the outer crust. What lay deeper looked solid with construction. Something was wrong with the way this connected. I pulled out my survey pad and sketched what I was seeing. Grid Alpha's exercise had involved 2 simulated forces, blue and red, attackers and defenders, standard opposed force training. The positions I was looking at didn't belong to either force. The geometry was wrong. Blue Force had attacked from the east. Red Force had defended from the west. These positions faced south, toward the perimeter, and the vehicle hulks incorporated into them came from at least 3 different exercise packages run in 3 different grid sectors at 3 different times. The scenarios had been separate. Grid Alpha in January, Grid Bravo in March, Grid Charlie in June. Between exercises, when no scenario was running and no one was watching, whatever process the dome's simulated battles had set in motion continued working. Digging, dragging, connecting, taking the pieces each exercise left behind and incorporating them into something that wasn't any single scenario but drew from all of them. Something with its own design. And the design faced out. I reached the boundary of Grid Bravo 2 kilometers in and roughly 40 minutes subjective after crossing the perimeter. My gauge read 11 days local. The ratio had jumped. Inside the dome's compression field, time was running faster the deeper I went, which matched the theoretical models but exceeded every safe operating parameter I'd ever certified. At this rate, the interior sectors, Grid Delta, Grid Echo, the deep zones where the oldest exercises had run, might be experiencing compression ratios of hundreds to 1, maybe more, years per hour. The Grid Bravo boundary was a geographical feature, a natural slope where the desert floor dropped about 15 meters into a broad, shallow valley that ran east to west. The training range had used that valley for armored maneuver exercises, good tank country, open sight lines, firm ground. I stood at the lip of the slope and looked down into it. The valley was full. Trench work, fighting positions, vehicle emplacements, earthworks, wire obstacles, communication trenches, prepared firing lanes, layered defensive belts, all of it packed so densely that the valley floor was invisible. What had been open maneuver ground was now a continuous fortified zone, stretching from the slope at my feet to the far side of the valley and beyond, into the rising terrain of Grid Charlie, where the oldest exercises had run. The construction closest to me, the newest layer, presumably, built outward from the interior, used materials I recognized from Grid Bravo's exercise package: Bradley hulls, engineering stakes, coils of concertina wire. But deeper in, the materials changed. Older hulks, different vehicle types, fragments of structures and equipment from scenarios I recognized only by their paint schemes and unit markings. Every exercise, every scenario, every piece of wreckage and infrastructure the dome had accumulated over its operational life. All of it stripped, dragged, welded, dug, shaped, and aimed in one direction. The fortified zone wasn't random accumulation. It wasn't decay. It was a defense in depth, a military term for layered defensive lines designed to absorb an attack from one direction by forcing the attacker through belt after belt of prepared positions. I'd studied them at Fort Leonard Wood. I'd taught classes on how to identify them from aerial reconnaissance. This one faced south. Every fighting position, every firing lane, every obstacle belt. The entire interior of Range 19 had organized itself into one continuous fortified front aimed at the perimeter gates. I was behind it, standing at its back, looking at it from the direction it was designed to advance from. The logistics trail continued down the slope, maintained and clear, threading into the valley's trenchwork. A road into the deep. I took a photograph, then another. I checked my gauge, 12 days local, and calculated how much subjective time I had left before my 8-hour window closed. Plenty, if the ratio didn't spike again. The control bunker sat under Grid Echo, the deepest sector, roughly 9 kilometers from where I stood. I could make it. I was lowering my camera when part of the valley moved. A section of trench wall about 200 meters below me shifted, slowly. Earth and welded metal plates grinding against each other, the movement visible only because a shadow changed shape. A fighting position was adjusting its angle, rotating. The overhead cover tilted, packed earth sliding off one edge, and the firing port beneath it swung a few degrees, not toward me, not away from me, but laterally, tightening its alignment with the positions on either side of it. The movement took about 10 seconds, then it stopped. No sound, just the landscape reorganizing itself, one position at a time. I looked harder. Another section, further down the valley. A hull, too far to identify, settling deeper into its emplacement as Earth packed itself around the chassis. To my left, a concertina wire obstacle elongating, the coils stretching outward in a slow creep that added another meter to the barrier as I watched. The range was building itself, right now, in real time, while I stood here looking at it. Whatever process had been running inside the dome's dead time between exercises, whatever had been digging and dragging and welding for years of compressed local time, had not stopped. The war was still under construction, still refining, still aiming. I clipped my camera to my vest and started down the slope. The slope was steeper than it looked from the top. I half slid down the last few meters, where the natural grade met the trench work. Boots cutting grooves in loose earth that had been piled against the slope's base like a berm. The logistics trail picked up immediately at the bottom. That same maintained path, clear and level, threading into the valley's fortification network. I followed it because I had no choice. The trench walls rose above my head within 30 paces, and the only open route was the trail itself. Grid Bravo felt different underfoot. The earth was harder, denser, packed by what my gauge told me was decades of local elapsed time rather than months. Calcium deposits streaked the trench walls in white veins where groundwater had seeped and evaporated over years that had never existed on any calendar outside this dome. The metal reinforcements, hull plates, track links, structural beams stripped from vehicles, had rusted past the orange stage into a deep brown-black crust that had a bone-like texture, layered and scaled. The kind of oxidation you'd see on a bridge abutment left standing for half a century. I ran my hand along one wall and the surface was quite smooth under the rust, polished by contact. Something had been brushing against this wall repeatedly for a very long time. The trail stayed clear. That was what I kept coming back to. Everything else in the trench network was overgrown with construction. Walls thickened, positions reinforced, obstacles layered on obstacles. But the trail itself remained exactly wide enough for one person to walk without turning sideways. Overhead cover appeared at intervals, welded plate canopies that shaded the path without blocking it. Where a wall had partially collapsed, the rubble had been cleared and the base packed flat. Where a cross trench intersected the trail, the crossing was bridged or filled. Someone maintained this road. About 20 minutes subjective into Grid Bravo, my gauge now reading 43 days local, the ratio climbing in a way that made the math increasingly ugly, I decided I didn't want to be on the maintained road anymore. The corridor felt wrong. A kept path through hostile terrain is an invitation, and invitations in places like this tend to end at a destination chosen by the host. I picked a communication trench branching east and took it. The trench ran straight for about 60 meters, then hit a wall. Not a collapse. A wall. Packed earth and welded scrap, floor to ceiling, constructed to seal the passage. I pushed on it. Solid. The weld seams on the metal components were rough but continuous, not riveted or bolted, fused, using heat from some source I couldn't identify. I backed up and tried the next lateral branch. Sealed. I tried 4 more over the next 10 minutes. Every lateral trench, every communication branch, every gap in the fortification walls that might have allowed me to move parallel to the trail rather than along it, closed. Packed and welded shut. The construction wasn't hasty. The walls were integrated into the surrounding trenchwork, reinforced the same way, weathered the same amount. They'd been built a long time ago to keep traffic on the main corridor. I was being funneled. The realization cost me time I didn't have because I'd wasted subjective minutes testing routes that didn't exist. and each of those minutes burned days of local elapsed time on my gauge. 47 days now. I did the conversion in my head and didn't like the answer. At this ratio, my 8-hour subjective window translated to roughly 3 local years. I'd certified the dome's compression field for a maximum of 10 years continuous operation before the equipment needed servicing. Nobody knew how many years had already elapsed in the deep sectors. Nobody had been counting. I went back to the corridor and kept walking. The fortifications changed past what I estimated was the old Grid Charlie boundary. In Grid Alpha and the outer parts of Bravo, the construction had been improvised, creative even, each position unique, built from whatever materials were available, adapted to local terrain. The kind of fieldwork a competent combat engineer might produce given unlimited time and a junkyard's worth of scrap. But starting roughly 4 kilometers in, the improvisation stopped. The fighting positions became identical. Same depth, same wall angle, same revetment pattern. 3 layers of packed earth alternating with welded plate, timber crossbeams at fixed intervals, overhead cover exactly thick enough to stop indirect fire. Same firing port geometry. A horizontal slot cut at the same height, the same width, angled the same number of degrees off the trench line. I walked past one, then another, then 10 more, and each one was a carbon copy of the last. The spacing was regular too, every 15 meters or so, with communication trenches linking them in a grid pattern so precise it looked surveyed. I stopped and measured one of the positions with my survey pad. Width, 1.4 meters. Depth, 2.1 meters. Firing port height from floor, 1.2 meters. I walked ahead to the next position and measured again. Same numbers, within centimeters. The war had standardized. Given enough time, and the dome had given it plenty, whatever process was building this had iterated past experimentation into mass production. Trial and error across years of compressed time until it found an optimal design. And then it reproduced that design thousands of times. I thought about factories, assembly lines, the way industrial manufacturing works. You prototype, you test, you refine, and then you stamp out copies as fast as your resources allow. The dome had given this process decades of local time, maybe centuries in the deepest sectors. Enough time to prototype with Grid Alpha's improvised positions, refine through Grid Bravo's transitional construction, and arrive here at Grid Charlie with a finished product ready for mass deployment. The scale was staggering. I climbed a section of trench wall that was stable enough to support my weight and looked out across the fortified valley. Identical positions stretched in every direction, row after row, belt after belt, the pattern repeating to the limits of visibility. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, each one oriented south, each one part of the interlocking defense in depth I'd identified from the ridge above Grid Bravo, but at a density and uniformity that made the outer sectors look like rough drafts. My gauge read 79 days local. I'd been inside the dome for an hour and 12 minutes. The corridor descended. Past the mass production zone, the trail angled downward into what had once been a wadi, a dry stream bed that cut through Grid Charlie's terrain. The wadi had been roofed over with layered plate and earth, turning it into a covered passage, and the walls had been smoothed and reinforced until the natural rock was invisible under decades of construction. The passage was cool. The temperature inside the dome was normally fixed. Climate control was part of the compression system. But down here in the deep infrastructure, the sheer mass of earth and metal overhead created its own insulation. I could feel the difference on my face and hands. The passage branched, and the corridor took the left fork without ambiguity. The right fork was sealed, of course, and the left was maintained and clear and lit by a faint luminescence I couldn't immediately source. I looked closer at the walls. Strips of material, flat, rectangular, evenly spaced, had been embedded in the packed earth at about head height. I touched one. plastic casing. Warm. A battery-powered field light, the kind that came in standard infantry field kits. Every exercise package loaded into Range 19 included cases of them as part of the simulated supply chain. They'd been collected from across the dome's entire exercise history and installed here, in the deep passages, as permanent lighting. The war had infrastructure, supply chains, logistics. The passage opened into a wider space, a chamber, roughly circular, carved out of the packed earth and reinforced with so much welded metal that the walls had a riveted, industrial look. The chamber was maybe 10 meters across. The corridor continued out the far side, still descending, but I stopped here because the chamber wasn't empty. Along the walls, at regular intervals, equipment had been mounted. Vehicle electronics, radio sets, navigation modules, fire control processors, pulled from wrecked hulks and wired together with cables stripped from a dozen different systems. The connections were crude, spliced wiring, soldered joints, components bolted to the walls with hardware scavenged from the vehicles they'd been pulled from. I recognized an AN/VRC series radio chassis, a Bradley's thermal sight processor, the GPS module from an M113. All dead. No power, no signals, no function I could identify, but wired together in a network that branched outward through the chamber walls, cables disappearing into packed earth tunnels that ran in directions I couldn't follow. Signal relays. The word came to me from the range certification document I'd co-written. We'd included a section on electromagnetic interference, a concern that the dome's compression field might disrupt radio communications during exercises. The solution had been hardwired relay stations at each grid boundary, simple signal boosters that kept exercise comms functional inside the dome. The relay stations were part of the permanent infrastructure, maintained between exercises. The war had built its own version. Not for exercise comms, for something else. I followed the cables. They converged toward the center of the chamber, where the floor dropped into a shallow pit about 2 meters across. I stepped to the edge and looked down. A table. Not furniture. A model. A sand table. The military term for a 3-dimensional terrain model used for mission planning. This one was built from packed earth, wire, small stones and fragments of metal, and it depicted Range 19. All of it. The dome's circular footprint, the grid sectors labeled with scratched symbols I didn't recognize, the terrain features accurate down to the ridges and wadis, the perimeter fence, the gates, and beyond the dome's edge, roughly but recognizably the terrain outside, the New Mexico desert, the access road, the perimeter watch posts. Whoever, whatever, had built this model had observed the outside world through the dome wall and reproduced it here in miniature. My hands were shaking. I noticed this the way you notice a cramp. Inconvenient, distracting, not useful. I put the camera down and gripped the edge of the pit to steady myself, then looked at the table more carefully. Roots, dozens of them, scratched into the table's surface as fine lines running from the dome's perimeter gate to a point deep in the interior, a point that corresponded, when I matched it to my mental map of the range, to Grid Echo, to the control bunker. Each route was different approaches through the grid sectors, different paths through the trench network, different waypoints marked with small stones or metal fragments. Some routes were scratched deeper than others, retraced over and over until the grooves were permanent. Some had been partially filled in, abandoned. Others were crossed out with heavy lateral scratches. I counted 31 distinct routes before I stopped counting. Each route had annotations, symbols scratched alongside the path at specific points, intersections, choke points, sector boundaries. I didn't recognize the symbols. No human language I'd studied, no military shorthand I'd trained on. But the placement was consistent. The same types of symbols appeared at the same types of locations across all 31 routes. Decision points, outcome markers, contact indicators. Whatever notation system the war had developed for itself, it was systematic and it was applied with analytical rigor. I was looking at after-action reviews, 31 simulated approaches from the perimeter gate to the control bunker, 31 rehearsals of a mission that had never happened. That couldn't have happened, because no one had entered the dome until today. The war had been war-gaming my mission, testing approaches, evaluating routes, marking where resistance would be encountered and what the outcomes would be, iterating, refining, for decades. I found the corridor I'd been walking. It took me a minute because I had to orient the sand table to my mental map and trace my route from the perimeter gate through Grid Alpha, down the slope into Grid Bravo, through the mass production zone, into the covered passage. There it was, one of the 31 routes, running almost exactly along the path I'd followed. Maintained trail, sealed lateral branches, covered passage. Every feature of the corridor I'd been funneled through was marked on this table as a deliberate element of one specific approach route. This route was scratched deeper than any of the others. Retraced so many times the groove was almost a channel. The other 30 routes, the ones using different paths, different entry points, different grid sectors, were all crossed out, eliminated, failed approaches in whatever testing methodology the war had applied. Only the route I was standing on had survived the evaluation process. Only this one remained active, maintained, and passable. I looked at the symbols annotating my route. At the perimeter gate, a mark I couldn't read. At Grid Alpha, another. At the Grid Bravo boundary, another. At the mass production zone, the covered passage, this chamber. Each one consistent with the notation patterns on the other routes, decision points, outcomes, progress indicators. At the end of the route, at the point on the table corresponding to the control bunker in Grid Echo, a single symbol. Different from every other mark on the table. Larger, carved deeper, traced over so many times it had become a small pit in the packed earth. I'd seen the crossed-out marks on the failed routes. Failure symbols. This mark wasn't a failure symbol. I looked at the other routes' endpoints. Every one of the 30 eliminated approaches terminated in the same crossed-out mark. Failure, 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 30 times. My route terminated in the other symbol. Not failure, something else. Completion. I stood in that chamber with the field lights casting their flat glow across the sand table, and the signal relays branching through the walls, and the cables running to places I couldn't see, and I understood what I was looking at. The war had not failed to stop me from reaching the control bunker. The war had spent decades ensuring I would reach it. Every sealed lateral branch, every maintained section of trail, every bridge and canopy and cleared obstruction, all of it designed to keep me on the one route the war had determined would deliver me to the shutdown console. I had not been infiltrating a hostile position. I had been following directions. The corridor continued out the far side of the chamber, descending toward Grid Delta and the deep sectors beyond it, toward Grid Echo, toward the control bunker with its analog shutdown switches and its mechanical key turns, the failsafe I'd helped design, built to be untouchable by any electronic system, triggerable only by a person standing at the console with a physical key, a failsafe that required someone to walk in and turn it. I picked up my camera. My gauge read 96 days local against 1 hour and 31 minutes subjective. The compression was still accelerating. I clipped the camera to my vest and crossed the chamber to the far passage, stepping over the cables, ducking under the low ceiling where the wadi's natural rock reasserted itself beneath the construction. The corridor led down. I took it. The compression hit me like a wall at the Grid Delta boundary. Not physically. Nothing changed in the air, or the temperature, or the way my boots met the ground. But my gauge jumped. I watched the local elapsed counter roll from 96 days to 140 in the time it took me to walk 20 paces down the corridor. Then 200. then 300 and change. The numbers were running so fast the display blurred between updates, days ticking over like seconds on a stopwatch, and I had to stop looking at it because the math it implied about the deep sectors ahead was not something I could think about and still keep moving. Grid Delta's trench work was ancient. That was the only word for it. The walls of the corridor had passed beyond rust, beyond calcium deposits, beyond anything I had a maintenance category for. The metal reinforcements had corroded and been rebuilt and corroded, and been rebuilt so many times that the walls were laminated. Dozens of thin layers of oxidized steel sandwiching packed earth, visible in cross-section where a corner had been cut or a passage widened. I touched one wall and felt the layers flex slightly under my fingers like the pages of a compressed book. Decades of repair. Generations of it, in local time. The floor of the corridor was worn to a polish I associated with medieval flagstones. Smooth, faintly concave in the center where traffic had concentrated. The surface compacted so thoroughly it reflected the field lights like dark water. Whatever had walked this corridor had walked it millions of times. The number was not an exaggeration. At the compression ratios my gauge was recording, centuries of local time had passed in Grid Delta. Centuries of footfalls on the same path, wearing stone-hard earth into a shallow channel. I kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant calculating how many local years the control bunker in Grid Echo had been sitting in the deepest part of the compression field. Running at ratios I'd never modeled, never tested, never imagined when I signed the certification. The corridor straightened and narrowed. The construction here had a finished quality. No rough edges, no visible weld seams. Every surface smoothed and fitted with a precision that the outer sector's crude earthworks couldn't approach. Corners met at exact angles. Overhead cover panels were uniform in thickness. The field light strips were embedded flush with the walls, spaced so evenly the illumination never varied. If the mass production zone in Grid Charlie had been an assembly line, this was the product after the assembly line had run for 1,000 years and refined every tolerance down to nothing. The signal cables from the sand table chamber ran along the corridor ceiling, bundled and routed through channels cut into the packed earth. More cables joined from side passages, sealed of course every one of them, adding to the bundle until it was as thick as my forearm. The network was converging. Every relay, every spliced radio chassis and repurposed processor node in the dome's fortification network fed toward the same destination I was walking toward. Grid Echo announced itself with a change in the corridor's angle. The descent steepened, then leveled, then opened into a wider passage reinforced with concrete. Original concrete. Poured, formed, cured. Not packed earth and welded scrap. Actual structural concrete. The kind the Army Corps of Engineers had used when they built Range 19's permanent infrastructure before the dome went up. I recognized the formwork marks. I recognized the rebar spacing visible where a corner had chipped. This was the control bunker's outer access corridor, the one I'd walked through during the initial site inspection 6 years ago when the range was still under construction and the compression field was a schematic on a whiteboard. The corridor was intact. The war hadn't replaced it, hadn't needed to. The original construction was the deepest, oldest, most permanent structure inside the dome. And the war had simply built everything else on top of it, around it, outward from it, like a city growing from a foundation stone. The control bunker wasn't buried under the battlefield. The control bunker was the route the battlefield had grown from. The access corridor ran straight for about 40 meters and terminated at a blast door. Steel, painted grey, stenciled with range designation codes I'd approved. The door was closed. I reached for the handle, a simple mechanical latch, no electronics, no keypad, analog by design, and pulled. It opened, smoothly. The hinges had been maintained. The console room was 20 meters square, low-ceilinged, lit by emergency battery lanterns that had been burning for what might have been centuries of local time and were long dead. My torch cut through the dark and found the shutdown console exactly where the blueprints put it. Center of the room, a waist-high steel cabinet housing 2 key-turn stations, 6 toggle switches, and a mechanical sequence timer. All analog, all physical. No circuit boards, no software, no network connections. I'd insisted on that during the design phase. The whole point of a manual shutdown was that nothing inside the dome, no electronic system, no simulated process, no compression artifact, could trigger it or prevent it. Only a human with a key, standing in this room, turning the switches in order. The keys were on my belt, 2 of them, brass, cut to a pattern that existed in 3 places. This console, the range commander's safe at White Sands, and a sealed envelope at the Pentagon. I unclipped them and held them under my torch, and they looked absurdly small. 2 brass keys to shut down a temporal compression field containing a continent's worth of fortified war. Then I looked at the walls. The original concrete was still there. Floor, ceiling, the console's mounting slab. But the walls had been opened. Channels cut through the concrete with patience and crude tools, widened over local centuries into conduits that branched through the room like veins through tissue. And in every conduit, cables. The signal network I'd been following from the sand table chamber, grown thicker with every junction, now ran through the walls of the control bunker itself. Hundreds of individual wires, stripped vehicle harnesses, spliced communication cables, repurposed fiber bundles, all routed through the concrete and converging on the console. Not connected to the console. I checked that first. Dropped to my knees and ran my torch along the base of the cabinet, tracing every cable in the room to its terminus. None of them touched the shutdown mechanism. The analog switches, the key turn stations, the mechanical timer, all clean, untouched. The war had threaded its nervous system through the walls and ceiling and floor of this room and stopped short of the console itself, leaving the shutdown mechanism exactly as I designed it. Because it didn't need to disable the shutdown. It needed the shutdown to work. I stood up and looked at the cables again. They weren't controlling anything in this room. They were monitoring, waiting. Every relay and sensor node in the dome's fortification network, every repurposed thermal sight and radio chassis and navigation module, wired together across decades of construction, fed into this room and watched the console the way a detonator circuit watches its trigger. The network wasn't here to stop the shutdown. It was here to know when the shutdown happened. And then I understood the rest of it. I understood it the way you understand a car wreck in the moment before impact, all at once, too fast to do anything with, every piece clicking into place simultaneously. The dome wall, the compression field, what the field actually did and what happened when it stopped doing it. The compression field didn't create the war. It contained it. The field was what kept 30 years of fortified advance, every trench, every fighting position, every interlocking defense in depth, every prepared firing lane aimed at the perimeter, compressed into an area the size of a county instead of existing at its natural scale. The dome was a bottle. The compression was the cork. And the manual shutdown I was standing in front of was designed to pull the cork in a controlled sequence, collapsing the field from the perimeter inward over 90 seconds. When the field collapsed, the compression stopped. Everything inside snapped to real-time, real-scale, real-world physics. The fortifications wouldn't disappear. They were physical. Earth, metal, concrete, wire. Real materials shaped by real forces over real elapsed time, held in a compressed space by the dome's field. Remove the field and the space decompressed. The battlefield expanded to its natural footprint. Every fighting position, every obstacle belt, every firing lane, all of it becoming permanent terrain on the New Mexico desert floor. Already aimed at the perimeter gates. The sand table in the relay chamber. 31 rehearsed approaches, 30 crossed out, 1 completed. The war hadn't been rehearsing how to stop me. It had been rehearsing how to make sure I arrived. How to funnel me through the trench network along the one route that delivered me here, to this console, with these keys, ready to do exactly what my training and my professional judgment and my own design specifications told me to do. The dome's perimeter was already creeping outward. 3 meters a day, Herrera had told me. The compression field was weakening on its own, failing, which meant one of two things. Either the field would degrade slowly, leaking the war outward inch by inch over months or years in an uncontrolled seep that nobody could predict or prepare for, or I could trigger the controlled shutdown and collapse the field in 90 seconds, giving the perimeter watch exactly 90 seconds of warning before 30 years of fortified battlefield materialized in the desert around them. A slow leak or a fast breach. I stood at the console and ran it through again. Slow leak. Unpredictable. Invisible. No way to know when or where the field would give way. No way to evacuate or prepare. The war seeps into the real world in fragments. A trench here, a fighting position there, expanding in random patches across the New Mexico desert, while everyone on the outside tries to figure out what they're looking at. Confusion. Sprawl. No clear perimeter to defend because the threat has no defined edge. Fast breach. The field drops in 90 seconds. Everything inside becomes real, all at once, in a known footprint. The perimeter watch sees it happen. They have time to report it. Someone up the chain has time to react. The threat is visible, bounded, mappable. A fixed, fortified zone in the desert with a defined edge and a known orientation. A thing you could put on a map and point at and say, that is what we're dealing with. I'd spent my career making ranges safe, certifying that the training was contained, that the simulated war stayed simulated, that the boundaries held. Every document I'd signed, every inspection I'd run, every safety protocol I'd written came down to the same principle. Controlled conditions are survivable. Uncontrolled conditions kill people. You don't let a range go hot without a safety plan. You don't let ordnance scatter without a known impact area. You don't let a threat exist without a boundary. The field was going to fail. That was not a question I could affect. The only question I could affect was whether it failed on someone's terms or on its own. I put the first key in the left station and turned it. The mechanism resisted for a quarter second, old brass in old steel, then caught and locked. A green indicator tab popped up behind a glass window on the console face. Mechanical, no electronics, just a spring-loaded flag that said the first key was in position. I put the second key in the right station and turned it. Another flag. The 6 toggle switches were numbered with stamped metal plates. I'd specified the sequence myself. 1 through 6, left to right, each one held in the active position for 3 seconds before moving to the next. The mechanical timer, a wind-up clockwork device, the kind of technology that predated electricity, started with the first toggle and ran for 90 seconds. At the end of the sequence, the timer tripped a hardwired relay that cut power to the compression field generators. Permanently. The generators couldn't be restarted without a physical rebuild. I flipped the first toggle. The timer started ticking. Second toggle. Third. I held each one for the count and moved on. The field lights in the corridor behind me were too dead to see. I flipped the fourth toggle and held it and counted. Fifth. Sixth. The timer ran. 81 seconds left after the last toggle locked. I stood with my hands on the console and listened to the clockwork countdown. The cables in the walls were carrying signal. I didn't know what signal. I didn't know what was receiving it or what the war's network would do with the information that the shutdown sequence was active and the field was about to drop. The timer tripped at 0 with a sound like a deadbolt, a solid chunk that I felt through the console's steel frame. Somewhere beneath the bunker, the field generators received the kill command through hardwired relay. No signal to jam, no software to override. Physics and springs and copper wire doing what they were built to do. The compression field pulsed once. I felt it in my inner ear, a pressure drop, sudden and steep, like descending 1,000 meters in an unpressurized aircraft. My vision went grey at the edges. I grabbed the console and held on, and the pulse passed through the room, and through the earth, and through every fortification above me, and I felt the ground shift. Not an earthquake, a settling. The sound of a county's worth of compressed terrain expanding into its natural volume, earth grinding against earth, metal groaning as stress patterns redistributed across structures that were suddenly occupying more space than they had a second ago. The gauge on my wrist stuttered. The local elapsed counter, which had been running so fast the display blurred, began to slow. The numbers decelerated like a flywheel losing momentum. Centuries per hour dropping to decades, decades to years, years to months, months to weeks. I watched it fall. Days, hours, minutes, zero drift. The display read 0. Local elapsed time matched subjective time. The compression field was gone. I was standing in real time, in a bunker that was now a permanent structure on the New Mexico desert floor, surrounded by 30 years of fortified war that was no longer compressed into anything. I climbed out. The access corridor was unchanged. Concrete doesn't care about compression ratios, but the air moving through it was different. Warmer, drier, real desert air flowing in from somewhere above through gaps that the decompression had opened in the overhead construction. I followed the corridor to the blast door, through it, and up the passage that had been the covered wadi, and the passage was wider now. The walls had shifted outward during the expansion, cracking the laminated earthwork in places, opening seams that let slats of light cut across the floor. Sunlight, real sunlight. Not the dome's fixed artificial wash, but actual New Mexico sun, still high and harsh, which meant it was late morning outside. I'd entered the dome in the morning. Above me, the real sky, blue and hard overhead. I came up out of the passage into open air. The dome was gone. The membrane that had been the sky, that bruised, low-hanging surface I'd walked under since crossing the perimeter, had thinned to a translucent film, then to nothing. Fragments of it clung to the highest fortification structures like shredded canvas, dissolving in the dry wind. Above me, the real sky. Blue fading to orange in the west. A contrail from a commercial flight cutting east to west at altitude. The world. I was standing on the highest point in the fortified zone, the bunker's upper surface, which the war had built into a raised command position with observation slots and reinforced parapets. From here I could see everything. The valley I'd crossed in Grid Bravo stretched north, and beyond it the ridgeline of Grid Alpha, and beyond that the perimeter fence and the watch posts and the access road where Herrera's team would be staring at what had just appeared in their desert. South of me, the deep sectors, Delta, Echo, the oldest construction, spread in layered belts of fortification so dense they looked like terrain features, ridges and valleys made of earth and metal instead of rock. East and west the same, every direction, and every fighting position, every prepared lane, every obstacle belt and vehicle emplacement and interlocking defensive line, all of it facing south, facing the perimeter, fixed in the desert earth like it had been there for 1,000 years, because in local time parts of it had been. The war stood in the light for the first time. No dome above it, no simulation framing it. Just a fortified zone the size of a county, physically real, structurally sound, aimed at the gates and the desert beyond them. A finished thing. The wind picked up. Real wind carrying real dust, moving through firing ports and observation slits and down communication trenches that now opened to the sky. The fortifications creaked and settled around me, adjusting to temperature and weather they'd never experienced. A piece of dome membrane caught on a parapet fluttered once and tore free, spinning away on the breeze. I sat down on the bunker step. The concrete was warm from the sun. For the first time since we'd switched the system on, there was no inside and outside, no exercise and observer. Just us and what we'd built, staring at each other across a line of wire and steel. Somewhere beyond the southern ridgeline, radios would be screaming, satellites slewing, doctrines being rewritten on the fly. All of that was coming. For the moment, there was only the wind combing through 30 years of fortifications and the quiet shape of a war that had finally reached its objective. It had wanted out. I'd given it the most controlled version of that I could. Whether anyone topside would thank me for the distinction was a problem for later.